Welcome to the Big Sky. I'm Anthony Crescenzo. Going into week 2 of conference action, let's look at the standings. Eastern, Weber, UC Davis, Montana State, the Grizz, and NAU are all tied up at 1-0. Idaho State is in flux with the double goose egg, and Sac State, Idaho, Portland State, Cal Poly, Northern Colorado, and Southern Utah are all tied up in 3rd place. 4 teams are on FCS Top 25 this week, starting with the number 5 Eagles moving up a peg. Weber State also moves up 1. Number 17 Montana shoots up 2 spots, and UC Davis does the exact same thing. The number 19 Aggies round out our current picture. Cal Poly's Joe Prothro currently leading the FCS running back race with 113 touches, while Weber State's Josh Davis is tied up at the top with that 95-yard run. Montana's kicker Tim Semenza is tied for the most field goals made with 8. He's 8 for 8, by the way, which is perfect, just like Montana State's Tristan Bailey, who's 7 for 7. I'd like to know what's in the water, in the kicker's water in Montana. Weber State's wide receiver Rashid Shaheed leads in kick return yardage with an average of 37.3 per game. This week you can catch the Bears host North Dakota. You remember them, I know you do. The Eagles at Montana State, which is going to be Root Sports Game of the Week. The Vandals invite Portland State. NAU goes to Idaho State. And the Grizz visit Cal Poly, which is 11 Sports Game of the Week. Most of these games you can also see on Pluto TV, which has become my BFF over the past 2 years. If there's anything that I missed, please let us know. For the Conference Whiparound, I'm Anthony Crescenzo.
Week 4 in the Big South, aka Blowout Week, wrapped up with 5 of the 6 games being decided by 31 points or more. Let's start with the lone close game as Charleston Southern hosted number 12 Elon and fell 31-22. The Buccaneers took a 19-10 lead into the break. Then an early 3rd quarter field goal from Tyler Tekic put Charleston Southern up 12. But the Phoenix scored 21 unanswered to end the 3rd en route to their 9-point victory. Quarterback London Johnson scored all 3 Buccaneer touchdowns with his legs, totaling 119 yards on 14 carries. One of the 3 scores was a 78-yard run. Garner Webb traveled to Boone, North Carolina, and took on FBS Appalachian State. In a game that was never close, the Mountaineers jumped out to a 14-0 lead over the first 3 minutes in the contest. A Jordan Smith to Jonathan Blackman touchdown pass halfway through the quarter cut the score in half, but that's all the scoring the Runnin' Bulldogs would do, as Appalachian State scored 58 straight in their 72-7 rout. The Mountaineers had 4 scores of over 60 yards. Smith threw for 117 yards in the loss. After 2 minutes in Princeton, the Monmouth Hawks led the Tigers 3-0, thanks to a Matt Mascara 27-yard field goal. But 2 John Lovett TD passes gave the Tigers a 14-3 lead. But at the end of the first, Kenji Bahar found Vinny Grassero for his 37-yard catch and score to cut the deficit to 14-9. Princeton would go on to outscore Monmouth 37-0 the rest of the way en route to their 51-9 win at home. Bahar finished 23 for 35 with 232 yards and a score, while Reggie White Jr. reeled in 8 catches for 98 yards. Peter Guerrero added 109 yards on 12 carries in the loss. The Campbell Fighting Camels hosted Division II Saw University and shut out the Bears 42-0. Daniel Smith completed 22 of his 28 passes for 227 yards and 2 scores. Smith also added 100 yards on the ground on just 5 carries, with 2 of those touches resulting in touchdowns. Smith broke a 59-yard run 66 seconds into the afternoon, setting the tone for the rest of the day, as the Fighting Camels led 21-0 after 1 en route to their win. Aaron Blockman had 8 catches for 89 yards and a score. The Presbyterian Blue Hose defeated NAIA's Bluefield University 41-10 at Bailey Memorial Stadium. Bluefield held a 10-7 advantage early in the 2nd quarter, but the Blue Hose scored 3 straight touchdowns and took a 28-10 lead into the break. Presbyterian added a TD in the 3rd and the 4th to round out their scoring. Quarterback John Walker threw for 199 yards on 16 of 25 with 3 touchdowns, while Zola Davis ran for 108 on 18 carries with a score. Keith Pearson finished with 101 receiving yards, and Deshaun Davis reeled in 2 TD receptions. Redshirt senior defensive back Robert Baker also had a 34-yard pick six in the win. Number 5, Kennesaw State hosted Division II's Clark Atlanta University. The first 15 minutes were tightly contested as Clark Atlanta trailed by just 1 at the end of the first. But the next 45 minutes, they were anything but close, as the Owls showed why they're one of the best teams in the FCS, reeling off 56 points over the final 3 quarters en route to their 70-13 rout. Dual threat quarterback Chandler Burks completed 6 of his 11 passes for 53 yards and a touchdown through the air, and added 52 yards on 11 carries for 2 scores on the ground. Running back Shaquille Terry made the most of his touches, running for 70 yards and 2 scores on just 3 carries, while adding 37 yards and a score on 4 catches. 14 different Owls ran the ball in their blowout win. Now it's time to check out the updated Big South standings before we get into this week's action. Kennesaw State moved up a spot from number 5 to number 4 in the Stats FCS Top 25 as they sit tied atop the conference leaderboard with Campbell at 3-1. Monmouth is in 3rd at 2-2 with 1-1 Presbyterian in 4th. Gardner-Webb is 5th at 1-3, while the bottom spot belongs to winless Charleston Southern. Presbyterian will play an NAIA school for the 2nd straight week as they host Lindsey Wilson on Thursday night. The Blue Hose bring in the FCS's 4th best passing defense into this matchup. The Monmouth Hawks will host 1-3 Wagner. Wagner has lost 3 straight, having been outscored 150-48 during that span. The Hawks have the FCS's 13th best offensive attack, and they are led by quarterback Kenji Bahar, the conference's leading passer, with 1,082 yards. Charleston Southern looks to pick up their first win on the road as they travel to Hampton to take on the 1-2 Pirates, who have lost 2 straight. The Buccaneers have been outscored 84-28 through their first 2 games, and their offense has tallied just 489 total yards, which ranks in the bottom 10 in the FCS. Over in Bowie's Creek, North Carolina, 3-1 Campbell is hosting 3-1 North Alabama. Both teams are coming off wins over Division II schools. The Fighting Camels have a top 30 air attack and a top 40 ground game to help them en route to their over 31 points per game through their first 4 contests. Quarterback Daniel Smith has been their leader offensively so far, as his 916 passing yards rank 2nd in the conference. Gardner-Webb will host 2-1 Wofford. Wofford is ranked 7th according to Stats FCS. The Terriers are coming off a bye week and took FBS Wyoming down to the wire the last time they took the field. The Running Bulldogs have been outscored 145-23 during their 3-game losing streak and play one of the better defenses in the country. Gardner-Webb could be in for another long afternoon. Number 4, Kennesaw State will host 1-3 Samford. The Bulldogs have lost 3 straight, but all 3 games were decided by 10 points or less. In a battle of top 10 offenses, Samford brings in the nation's best air attack, while the Owls own the nation's 2nd best ground game. Kennesaw State will look to control the clock with their run game and limit the strong Bulldog offense with their defense, which is allowing just 15 points per game, the 12th best mark in the country. That will do it for this week in the Big South. Come by next week for all the results of Week 5 and more. For the FCS Conference Whiparound, I'm Frank LaSala.
This week was an exciting one in what was Week 2 of the Ivy League season, with some teams trying to continue a hot start and other teams fighting not to fall into the dreaded 0-2 hole. Let's not waste any more time and jump right into the action. We start out in the Garden State when we saw a matchup between 2 New Jersey teams, Princeton and Monmouth. This game was all about Princeton quarterback John Lovett, who threw for 332 yards and 5 touchdowns. On top of that, he ran for 71 more yards and another touchdown. Behind that monumental performance, Princeton was able to dominate Monmouth, winning by a final score of 51-9. Dartmouth traveled to Worcester, Massachusetts to take on the Crusaders of Holy Cross. This game was dominated by the Big Green's defense as they picked off Jeff Wade 4 times in this one. Dartmouth's offense took advantage of those turnovers, with quarterback Derek Kyler turning in a nice performance, throwing 258 yards and 3 touchdowns in this one. Dartmouth led this game early and never looked back as they pick up the W by a final score of 34-14. Penn hosted Lehigh this week in a clash of Pennsylvania universities. After surrendering an early field goal, Penn responded with back-to-back touchdowns from Kerrigan Brooks and never looked back after that. Brooks led the charge for the Quakers as he ran the ball 16 times for 163 yards and 3 touchdowns, also adding in 3 catches for 23 yards as well. Penn ended up winning this game handily by a final score of 30-10. Columbia hit the road last week to take on Georgetown for a showdown in the nation's capital. Columbia jumped out in front of this game early, scoring the first 23 points in this one as they held the Hoyas scoreless through the first 3 quarters. Georgetown made it interesting, scoring 2 touchdowns and converting on a 2-point conversion late in the 4th, making it a 1-possession game with just under 5 minutes left to play. Led by a stellar performance by receiver Ronald Jones II, who had 7 catches for 113 yards and a touchdown, Columbia was able to sneak away with a win in this one, 23-15. Cornell hosted Yale in the inaugural in-conference Ivy League game this season. This was a back-and-forth affair throughout the length of this game, as neither team had a larger lead than 9 points. Yale was able to pull it out in the end, led by their duo of running backs Spencer Alston, who had 120 yards and a touchdown, and Zane Dudek, who had 33 yards and 2 touchdowns. The Bulldogs won their first in-conference matchup 30-24. Finally, we saw Harvard travel to Rhode Island to take on Brown in their first in-conference matchups of the season. Early on, it appeared that Harvard was pulling away as they took a 24-3 lead into halftime. Give Brown credit, as they did not want to go down, as they scored 2 straight second-half touchdowns to make it a 1-score game with just over 12 minutes to go in the 4th quarter. Harvard ended up sealing the game on a 22-yard touchdown pass from Jake Smith to Adam Scott, as the Crimson would end up taking this game 31-17. Now let's take a quick look at next week's matchups. Harvard plays host to Rhode Island University. Yale will stay home to take on the University of Maine. Columbia will welcome in Princeton in their first in-conference matchups of the season. Dartmouth will host Penn in their first in-conference matchup this year. Cornell will stay home to take on Sacred Heart. Finally, Brown will stay home to take on Georgetown in search of their first win of the season. That's it for this week in the Ivy League. For Football Gameplan's FCS Whiparound, I'm Ian Gridley, and I'll see you next week.
It's never a dull moment in the Patriot League, as the Colgate Raiders seem to have jumped out to a great start and looks to be the class of the Patriot League. So let's take a look at the standings and see how things stack up.
Number 24, Colgate sits atop the Patriot League with a conference record of 2-0, followed by Georgetown and Lehigh. Bucknell and Fordham are winless on the season, and Holy Cross and Lafayette round out the bottom with an 0-1 conference record.
Now here's a look at some of the key games this week on the Patriot League schedule.
Georgetown travels to Providence to take on the 0-2 Brown Bears. Bucknell and Holy Cross will meet for their first conference game of the year. Lafayette welcomes in NEC foe Central Connecticut State. And number 24, Colgate, travels to CAA William & Mary.
Week 4 was full of upsets and chaos in the FCS, and the MEAC was no exception as conference play got underway. In a shocking upset, Morgan State defeated number 4 North Carolina A&T 16-13. Kicker Alex Rea was the star for the Bears, going 3 for 3 on field goals, including a 51-yarder and the game winner from 36 as time expired. In other action, Norfolk State won 17-7 over South Carolina State. Florida A&M defeated Savannah State 31-13, and Howard beat Bethune-Cookman in a barn burner 41-35. Taking a look at the standings in the MEAC, Norfolk State currently is in first place, with A&M, Howard, and Morgan State also undefeated in conference play. Big names North Carolina Central and A&T will look to bounce back into the discussion this week. Coming up in Week 5, North Carolina A&T will host South Carolina State Thursday night on ESPNU at 7 p.m. On Saturday, Delaware State will travel to Norfolk State, while Bethune-Cookman will look to rebound at Savannah State. But this week's big game will feature the Rattlers of Florida A&M traveling north to face the North Carolina Central Eagles. For the FCS Conference Whiparound, I'm David Hassagen.
There was plenty of excitement last week in the NEC. Price Wilson was on the money, throwing for 359 yards and 4 touchdowns as Bryant held off Robert Morris in a close one, 49-46. Kevin Duke did it all for the Pioneers on Saturday, throwing for 322 yards and 4 TDs, as well as running for one, as Sacred Heart defeated Wagner 41-14 to go 3-0 on the season. Even though Dolagala threw 2 touchdown passes, it was the defense that was the story in Saturday's 24-13 win over Fordham. The defense had 5 sacks and a pick 6. The Dukes had no answer for Cole McDonald, who threw 5 touchdowns in Hawaii's 42-24 win over Duquesne. The Dukes were held to only 166 total yards. The Red Flash wasted a strong performance by Fenimore, dropping this one to Albany 35-28. Abito Kuhn Hanks, no relation to Tom Hanks, started the scoring for the Great Danes, who never took their foot off the accelerator. Plenty of action coming up this week in the NEC. 3-1 Bryant travels to 3-2 Duquesne. Bryant will need the defense to step up this week against the Dukes. Even in the loss against Hawaii, Parr threw for 3 scores. If this turns into a shootout, the Bulldogs have plenty of receiving threats to rely on. Last week, Burt stepped up with 2 TDs. Central Connecticut State hopes to build on last week's win as they host 0-4 Lafayette, who got flossed by Colgate last week 45-0. The Leopards gave up 279 yards on the ground. This should be a remedy for the Blue Devils running game that has been pedestrian the past 2 weeks. 3-0 Sacred Heart hopes 0-2 Cornell. The Pioneers hope to keep their winning streak lasting a little longer against Big Red. Don't let that 0-2 record fool you. Cornell had a solid performance in last week's loss to Yale. The Pioneers need to contain Harold Coles, who had both a rushing and receiving touchdown last week. The 1-3 Red Flash hosts 0-4 Division II West Virginia Wesleyan this week. The Red Flash will need their defense to step up in this one after giving up 503 yards of offense last week to the Great Danes. We'll see if the lethal duo of Fenimore and Holder can continue their magic. After 3 straight losses, Wagner travels to 2-2 Monmouth. Monmouth coming off an absolute beatdown at the hands of Princeton. Can Ryan Folse continue his strong season against the Hawks defense that gave up 283 yards on the ground last week at Princeton? And 1-3, Robert Morris is off this week before its upcoming NEC showdown with Central Connecticut State. This is Scott Glennon with the FCS Whiparound.
One of the surprises so far this football season in the FCS has been the Pioneer League. And you look at the Stetson Hatters, led by their tight end Donald Parham, who's a Senior Bowl prospect, Senior Bowl watch list, 6'9", 235, and their leading touchdown receiving threat in the passing game. Let's take a look at the rest of the standings in the Pioneer League.
Stetson and Dayton sit atop the Pioneer League with Butler, Drake, Jacksonville, Morehead State, San Diego, and Valparaiso all starting conference play this week. Despite having a 3-1 overall record, Davidson sits at 9 with an 0-1 conference record, followed up by the Red Foxes of Marist.
And as we enter week 5, here's a look at some of the key games on the Pioneer League schedule this upcoming week.
Morehead State travels to Indiana to take on the Bulldogs of Butler. Jacksonville will host Drake. Dayton travels to Poughkeepsie to take on the Marist Red Foxes. Valparaiso welcomes in Davidson. And the Pioneer League game of the week will be Stetson traveling to the West Coast to take on San Diego.
Before we look forward to week 5, let's take a look at what happened in week 4. The 15th ranked Colonels defeated the 21st ranked Bearcats 27-7. The Lions defeated the Cardinals 30-24. Chase and Virgil threw for 285 in the win. The Lumberjacks won 24-21 over the Wildcats, and we had some ugly as BYU defeated the 10th ranked Cowboys 30-3. The updated Southland standings has the Cowboys, the Demons, and the Bears in the top 3. With the ugly play from the Cowboys in week 4, can they bounce back in week 5 as they take on the Lumberjacks at 7 p.m.? The Colonels look to continue its winning ways as they take on Lamar at 3:30 p.m., but my game to watch is the Bears and the Bearcats. This game is crucial for both, where a Bears win would give them a 2-0 conference record, along with an 0-2 conference record for the Bearcats. For me, I'm liking the Bears in this one. They are averaging 28.7 points per game, while the Bearcats have yet to prove to me that they can play consistent football. And that brings me to my weekly Twitter question. Do you have the Bears or the Bearcats winning this key week 5 game? For the FCS Whiparound, I'm Doug Sharabo.
What a difference a year makes for the Chattanooga Mocs, as this year they're undefeated and looks to be the class of the Southern Conference. And let's take a look at the rest of the standings as we see the standings are starting to get a little bit tight at the top.
Tight race at the top of the SoCon right now with number 20 Chattanooga, East Tennessee State, and number 7 Wofford, all sitting at 2-0 in the conference, followed up by Western Carolina, Mercer, and the Citadel. Furman, Sanford, and VMI have not yet recorded a conference win.
Each week in the SoCon, you're talking about big games, big matchups, and here's a look at the SoCon schedule for week 5.
Mercer hits the road and heads to Lexington to take on the 0-4 Keydets. Furman welcomes in 3-0 Western Carolina. The Citadel takes on CAA member number 25 Towson. Number 7 Wofford heads to Boiling Springs, North Carolina to take on the Running Bulldogs of Gardner-Webb. Sanford will head to number 4 Kennesaw State. And the game of the week in the SoCon sends Chattanooga to Johnson City to take on East Tennessee State.
Week 4 in the SWAC was filled with intriguing matchups as Southern U beat Alabama A&M in a close one, 29-27. Prairie View A&M handled Arkansas Pine Bluff easily, winning 62-13. Grambling picked up their first victory of the season, shutting out Alabama State 34-0. Alcorn State blew out Mississippi Valley State 56-20. And Texas Southern went down to Houston 70-14. Taking a look over at the standings, in the East, Alcorn State is in first with a 1-0 conference record. Jackson State comes in at number 2 with a clean conference record, having yet to play a conference game. Alabama A&M, Alabama State, and Mississippi Valley State round out the standings in the East. In the West, there's a 3-way tie for first between Southern, Prairie View A&M, and Grambling. Texas Southern and Arkansas Pine Bluff round out the standings in the West. Week 5 in the SWAC has only 4 games on the slate as Alabama A&M takes on Jackson State. Prairie View A&M battles Grambling in what should be the conference game of the year. Alcorn State goes up against Southern U, and Arkansas Pine Bluff battles FIU. For the FCS Conference Whiparound, I'm Max Bazzone.